The heat in the town of Kettle Fork had a weight to it that summer, a thing you could lean against, and on the hottest afternoon of the driest year anyone could remember, some 60 people crowded into the shade of the feed store's long porch, and none of them made a sound. They were waiting on a woman. She stood at the top of the steps with her hat pushed back and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and every man there who owned dying stock and cracking wells had come to her hat in hand, and every one of them remembered how they had laughed. Cassidy Vane was 31 years old and had been in the valley barely a year and a half, and now she held the fate of the whole district in the palm of one calloused hand. She did not raise her voice. She let the silence run until it hurt, because she had learned that a still thing waited on is a thing finally seen. What she was about to decide had in truth already been decided long before, not by her and not by any of them, but by the land itself, which keeps a longer ledger than men do and settles it in its own season. To understand why the men of Kettle Fork stood bareheaded before a woman they had once called a fool, you have to go back to a cold bright morning 18 months earlier, when Cassidy Vane rode into the valley with everything she owned lashed to a borrowed mule and $41 folded into her boot. She had buried a husband and a farm both in the same bad spring back east, a flood that took the bottomland and a fever that took the man, and she came west, not chasing anything so grand as a dream, but simply looking for cheap ground and a chance to be left alone. Kettle Fork was cheap ground. It sat in the rain shadow of a hard blue range, a stretch of the valley the old settlers had passed over, and the new ones only tolerated. And the parcel she found was the worst of it. 320 acres of gravel and sage that a bank had taken from a busted homesteader and could not give away. The land agent, a soft-handed man named Pruitt, who worked for the Ashwater Land and Livestock Consortium, sold it to her for $2 an acre on a note she would spend years paying, and smiled the whole time like a man selling a lame horse to a stranger. What made the men on the porch laugh, though, came a week later at the county stock sale, when Cassidy Vane spent nearly the last of her money on something no one else in the building would have carried home for free. There were 80 hogs in a broken pen behind the auction yard, the remnant of a herd whose owner had died, owing everybody half-wild razorback stock, gone lean and mangy, ribs like barrel staves, hides scabbed, a mean gaunt boar at the head of them, with one torn ear and an eye that did not flinch. The auctioneer could not raise a bid. Nobody wanted 80 starving hogs in a drought year, with feed dear and prices low. So Cassidy Vane stood up in the back and offered a quarter apiece, and the room turned to look at her. And the auctioneer, half in mockery and half in relief, cracked his gavel and said, "Sold, 80 head, for $20. And the whole yard laughed. $20 for the hogs, $4 to the drover who would haul them. $24, and folks in Kettle Fork would repeat that figure for a year, like the punchline of a joke. $24 for 80 walking skeletons, and they would say it about her the way you say a thing about a body you have already decided not to see. Pruitt found her at the pen while she was mending the tailgate of the wagon. He had that consortium smile on the warm one, and he leaned on the rail and looked at the hogs the way a man looks at spoiled milk. "Miss Vane," he said, "I'll do you a kindness. Those animals will die on that ground and break your heart doing it, and I've got a client who'll take the lot off your hands. I'll give you $30 right now, clean, and you can put it toward that note." It was, on its face, a generous offer, $6 of profit, for a morning's foolishness, and any sensible person would have taken it and walked away lighter. Cassidy Vane straightened up with a nail between her teeth, looked at the hogs a while, and looked at Pruitt longer. "No," she said, "that was all." "No?" Pruitt's smile did not move, but something behind it did. A small tightening, and he touched his hat and said, "Suit yourself," and there was a promise in the two words that she filed away and did not forget. She loaded the hogs and hauled them to her gravel and her sage, and that first night she sat on the cold ground among them by a low fire and did the only arithmetic that mattered to her then, which was the arithmetic of staying alive. $41 had become $14 against a winter, 320 acres of ground that grew stones, 80 mouths and her own to feed, and a note at the bank that came due whether it rained or not. She counted it 3 times, and each time it came out the same, and the sum of it was that she was one bad month from ruin. She had learned by then that the numbers do not lie and do not care. That you can add your want to a column all night, and the total will still be what it is at dawn. She banked a fire and lay down among the warm, stinking bodies of animals nobody else on earth had wanted, and she was as close to broken as she would ever come. What kept her from riding out was small. In the gray before sunrise, she woke to a sound of rooting, and there in the half-light the torn-eared boar had worked his snout down into a low seam of the gravel near the wash, and around him a dozen sows had joined in, digging with a purpose that was nothing like the aimless nosing of penned stock. And the ground they turned came up darker than the ground around it, and it held the faint green of something that had once tried to grow. Cassidy Vane watched them a long while. She did not understand yet what she was seeing, but she understood that the animals knew a thing about that ground that she did not, and that a creature knows its own business better than a stranger knows it for them. And something in her that had been ready to quit sat up instead and decided to stay and find out. She named the boar Ferryman for the way he went ahead of the others into hard places, and she opened the gate that morning and let them go where they would, rather than driving them where she thought they ought to be. And that single decision, small as a seed, was the beginning of everything the men on the porch would one day stand hatless to honor. The first weeks nearly killed her. She dug post holes in ground that turned her spade. She hauled water in barrels from a sinkhole 2 miles off. She doctored scabbed hides with a salve. She boiled herself and lost 3 of the weakest hogs anyway, and buried them, and marked the count down to 77, and did not let herself weep over it. Kettle Fork watched from a distance and made its jokes. At the mercantile the men would go quiet and then loud when she left and the word "hogwoman" got said. And worse. The phrase that would follow her all that year, that dismissive little verdict they hung on her like a bell on a stray. A lone woman playing at pigs. They called it a lone woman and her $24 mistake, and they said it the way men say a thing when they are secretly uneasy that they might be wrong. She heard it. She let it lie. She had figured out early that when you are certain of a thing and the world is certain against you, the surest reply is to say nothing and let the season do your arguing, because being proven right in its own time is a quieter and heavier answer than any word you could shout. So she said nothing, and she dug, and she watched her hogs, and she waited for the ground to teach her what the animals already knew. Help came from the direction she least expected, which is how help most often comes. Her nearest neighbor was an old woman named Brigitta Hulleran, though she had been born under a longer name in a cold country across the sea, and she had held the ridge above the valley for 40 years, and buried a husband and 2 grown sons up there, and was reckoned by the town as somewhere between a witch and a saint. Feared a little and respected a little, and left mostly alone. She came down the ridge one evening on a gray mule leading a second mule packed with a bag of seed potatoes and a coil of good rope, and she did not laugh. She sat on Cassidy's wagon tongue and watched Ferryman and his sows working the wash, and she was quiet so long that Cassidy thought she might be asleep. Then the old woman said, in her slow accented voice, that seemed to come up out of the ground itself, "The land does not forget, child. It only grows quiet. Men plow it and fence it and forget what ran here before them. But the earth keeps its old rivers folded up inside it like a letter it does not send." She nodded at the digging hogs. "Your pigs," she said. "They are not fools like the men in town. A pig's nose knows what is wet, and what is sweet a fathom down. They are reading a page you cannot see." Then she gave Cassidy the practical key that turned the whole thing, which was this. She told her to stop hauling water to the hogs, and to start following the hogs to the water. "Watch where they root and root again," she said. "Watch where the green tries to come. The land whispers, but it will not shout, so you must go close and put your ear against it." And with that, folk wisdom, plain as bread, Cassidy Vane stopped fighting her ground and began to listen to it. The other companion the season sent her was a boy. He was maybe 10 years old, thin as a fentrail, the youngest of the Corley children from the failing quarter section down the road, a family so poor and so proud that they had let their own well go bad rather than ask a neighbor's leave to dig on the line. His name was Toby, and he did not talk much, and he had a way of appearing at the fence in the early morning and standing there watching until Cassidy could not stand it and put him to work. He took to the hogs like they were his own kin. He named them all, every one, the sows and the shoats and the boar. She had already called ferrymen, and he could tell them apart at 50 yards by their gait, and he would sit for hours in the dust while they slept in a heap and lay his hand on ferryman's scarred flank without any fear at all. His own folk had no use for the animals, and less for the notion of a woman making a go of it alone. But Toby saw the sense of the thing before the sense had shown itself to anyone, and on the loneliest nights it was the boy's blunt certainty that steadied her. "They ain't dying," he said one evening, watching the herd. "They're just getting ready." She asked him ready for what. He shrugged the way children do when they know a thing they cannot say. "For whatever they've been rooting for," he said, and went home in the dark. So the summer turned, and Cassidy Vane did the one thing the whole valley reckoned impossible, which was nothing, or what looked like nothing. She let the hogs range the worst of her acreage, and she followed where they led. Where ferryman and his sows tore up the gravel, she did not smooth it back. She watched what came. And what came, first in patches and then in long dark ribbons, following the low seams of her land, was grass. The rooting broke the hard pan that had shed every rain for 30 years, and let the seed potatoes and the scattered forage seed Brigida had given her take hold in the turned ground. The hogs' own manure fed it. Their digging opened the crust so the little rain that fell soaked in instead of running to the wash and away. By the end of that first summer, the herd had rooted a broad crooked strip clear across the worst 40 acres of the parcel, and along that strip the ground had gone from gray to brown to a stubborn, hopeful green. And the hogs that had come to her as walking skeletons, which had fallen to 77, climbed past 130. Nobody in town saw it. The strip lay in a fold of the land you could not see from the road, and Cassidy did not go to town to speak of it, and so she carried the growing weight of her success like a coal a careful traveler banks low under the ash, giving off no light but holding all its heat, waiting for the hour it would be needed. "Let them pity me a while longer," she thought. A pitied woman is a woman left alone, and being left alone was worth more to her just then than being believed. But it was ferrymen who found the thing that changed the arithmetic altogether. In the deepest part of the dry season, when even the sinkhole she had hauled from went to cracked mud, the boar led the herd up a shallow draw at the far northwest corner of the parcel that Cassidy had never bothered to cross because the county plat showed nothing there but rock. She followed them on foot one hot noon and found the whole herd gathered in the draw, digging as she had never seen them dig. And the earth they threw up was not dark, it was wet, black and wet and cool. And when she knelt and put her hand into the hole, the hogs had opened. Water welled up cold against her fingers and would not stop welling. She dug with her spade beside them the rest of that day, half laughing, half afraid, and by evening she had opened a seep the width of a wagon, and by the third day, when she had cleared the gravel down to a fissure in the bedrock, it ran clear and steady and cold. A spring that had been sealed under the hardpan since before any white man drew a map of that valley, a fold of the old country Brigida had spoken of, an unsent letter the earth had at last handed over. She rode up the ridge that night and told the old woman, and Brigida only nodded as if she had known all along. "The land does not forget," she said again. It waited for something patient enough to ask. She helped Cassidy fence the spring and pipe it with hollowed sections of log down to a stone trough, and Cassidy kept its existence as close as she kept the coal of her success, because she understood, without being told, that a spring in a drought is not merely water, it is power, and power draws the wrong kind of men the way a green field draws crows. The first man to learn the true worth of what she had was a stranger, which was fitting, because it takes an outsider's eye to price a thing the neighbors have decided to despise. He came through in the fall driving a great herd of cattle north to the railheads. A lean weathered trail boss named Docker, who had been on the move for weeks, and whose stock was gaunt, and whose men were surly, and whose maps, like everyone's, showed no water in Kettle Fork. He came to Cassidy's gate because hers was the only ground in the valley showing green, and he offered to pay for the right to water his herd and graze the strip a few days. And when he tasted the spring and saw the fat condition of her hogs on ground that had beaten better men, he did not laugh. He looked at her the way you look at somebody who knows a trade. He paid her $60 in coin for 3 days of water and grass. More money than she had seen since she came west. More than double the price of the whole herd. Folks still joked about, and before he moved on, he told every drover and freighter he met that the hog woman at Kettle Fork had the sweetest water and the best conditioned ground between the range and the river. That was the first crack in the wall. The town heard it second-hand and did not know what to make of it. And Pruitt heard it too, and the consortium behind him heard it, and the warm smile came back down the road to Cassidy's gate not long after, and this time it did not offer $30. Pruitt came in a buggy with a leather case and a partner from the Ashwater head office, a heavy, quiet man named Coles, who did the consortium's harder work. They had learned what she had. A drought was tightening its grip on the whole territory by then, the worst in living memory, and water rights had become the only wealth that mattered, and the consortium was buying up every seep and creek and stock pond in 3 counties, consolidating them, meaning to hold the whole valley by the throat when the dry got bad enough. They offered Cassidy Vane $800 for the parcel, and the spring, and the herd, all together. And when she said no, they raised it to $1,200, a fortune enough, to buy a good farm and a green country, and never think of Kettle Fork again. She stood at her gate with Toby beside her, and Ferryman rooting behind her, and she said the same word she had said over the hogs a year before. No. Cole spoke then for the first time, low and flat. And he said, Miss Vane, you want to think hard. Water like yours draws attention. A lone woman out here, no man, no kin. One bad night is all it takes for a thing to go wrong. A fence cut, a fire, a well fouled. Awful hard to prove who done it. He let that sit. It would be a shame, he said. That was the first tightening of the screw, and Cassidy heard the threat clean under the false regret, and she did not flinch any more than ferrymen flinched. But that night she moved her bedroll up beside the spring, and she sat awake with her husband's old rifle across her knees, and she understood that the fight had truly begun. The pressure came in 3 waves, the way such pressure does. The first was rumor. Word went around Kettle Fork that the hog woman's water was foul, that hogs had died in it, that anything watered there would take sick. Poison talk sowed careful by Pruitt to spoil the value of the one spring the consortium could not buy. The second wave was the law or the shape of it. A county man appeared with papers claiming the old plat showed a right-of-way across her northwest corner, straight through the draw where the spring rose. A right-of-way the consortium had somehow acquired and meant to enforce. And it took Cassidy 2 hard weeks and most of her cattle money paying a plain, honest lawyer in the county seat to prove the plat was old and the claim was manufactured and the right-of-way had lapsed 40 years gone. She won it barely, but it emptied her purse again, and she went back to the arithmetic of survival. Only now the sum on the ground was different, because she had a spring and a strip of green, and a growing herd, and a name spreading among the drovers. And the total, when she added it, honest, came out for the first time on the side of hope. The third wave was Cole's, again in the dark this time. A fence cut one night, and a small fire set in her dry haystack, that she and Toby beat out with wet sacks before it caught the barn, and in the morning she found boot prints at the spring, and a place in the sage above the draw, worn smooth, where a man had lain a long time watching her count her hogs and measure her water. She said nothing to the sheriff, who was the consortium's man anyway. She banked her anger, like she banked everything, low and hot under the ash, and she waited, because she knew by then that the dry was coming to a head, and that when it did, all the accounts in the valley would fall due at once. The drought broke everything but her. It came on through that second summer, like the slow opening of a furnace door, day after day of white sky and dead wind, and one by one the outfits of Kettle Fork went under. The stock ponds turned to cracked clay. The shallow wells sucked air. The consortium's consolidated waters, so cleverly gathered, proved to be mostly the same failing surface sources, dressed up on paper, and they failed together, all at once, the way surface water does. Cattle died standing up in the fields, and the loudest of the men who had laughed at her, a big red prosperous rancher named Alton Squires, who had run 400 head on the flat and who had told the whole mercantile that a lone woman playing at pigs would be gone by first snow. Alton Squires was ruined worst of all, his herd dying by the score around a dead pond, his note called by the very consortium that had bled the valley dry. And Cassidy Vane's spring, fed from deep under the bedrock where no drought could reach, ran cold and steady as it had run for 10,000 years. And her rooted strip held its stubborn green, and her herd, 181 strong now and fat, drank its fill twice a day, while the valley died around it. She could have named any price. She could have watered the survivors at $1 a head an hour, and bought the whole district for pennies within a month. And the consortium, watching her from the ridge, expected exactly that. Expected her to turn predator now that the power had passed to her, because that was the only thing men like Coles understood. Alton Squires came to her gate on foot in the worst week of it, because his horse was too weak to ride. A big proud man gone gray in the face, and he stood there twisting his hat in his hands and could not look at her. "Miss Vane," he said, and had to start again. "Miss Vane, I got 60 head still breathing, and no water within a day's drive that ain't dried, or ain't the consortium's, and they want more than the cattle are worth." He swallowed. "I ain't got the money, and I ain't got the right to ask, after the things I said. But them animals are dying and I got no place else." He looked at her at last. "I'll owe you," he said. "Whatever you say." "Name it." Here was the moral hinge of the whole long season. The choice the land had been walking her toward since the morning she watched Ferryman root the first dark seam of earth. She could gouge the man who had scorned her and be within her rights, and it would have been a kind of justice. She looked at Alton Squires a long moment, and she looked past him at his 60 dying cattle, and she thought of the arithmetic she had done 100 cold nights, and she found that the sum had changed again, because a debt of water paid in a dying year is not the same as a debt of money, and she said, "Bring them in." Squires stared. She said, "Water's free to any beast that's thirsty on my ground. I'll not have a living thing die at my gate for want of what the land gives for nothing." But she was not soft, and she was not a fool, and she added the thing that made it whole. "You'll pay me in work," she said. "You in your hands, mending my fence, and digging my second trough, and hauling my winter wood, a fair day's labor for a fair day's water. And we'll call the water itself a gift, because you cannot rightly sell a gift the earth handed you free." Squires put his hat over his face and wept, a big ruined man crying at a fence in the heat, and drove his cattle in, and that was the beginning of the reckoning. Word of it ran through the dying valley faster than the rumor ever had, and by the next week they were coming, all of them, the men who had laughed and the men who had merely watched, hats in hand, and Cassidy watered every beast that came and took her pay in labor and in nothing else, and her ground filled with the stock of neighbors and her yard filled with the men working off their water. And Kettle Fork which had been dying alone in 100 separate ruins, began to gather itself around the one spring that had not failed. Which brings us back to that hottest afternoon on the feed store porch, the day the consortium made its last play. Coles and Pruitt had called the meeting themselves, meaning to seize what they could not buy, and Coles stood up before the crowded shade and made his case smooth and grave. The water at the Vane place was the only water left, and water so vital could not be left to the whim of one untrained woman, that the responsible course, the safe course, was for the consortium to purchase and manage it for the good of all, to ration it fairly and secure it against waste. And he named a price to Cassidy in front of everyone, generous sounding, $1,500, and asked was she not being selfish to refuse it. And Cassidy Vane, standing at the top of the steps, let the silence run the way she always did, and then she said, quiet enough that they all leaned in, "Mr. Coles, you say I don't know how to manage that water." She looked at him. "Then how is it you know that it runs 11 gallons the minute and stands 4 foot deep in the trough at noon, and that I've 181 head watering off it now, and not 180 like the papers say?" She let that hang. "Only a man been laying up in my sage counting my hogs through a glass would know a figure that close," she said. Coles's face did not move, but Pruitt's did, the smile finally slipping clean off, and every man on that porch understood in one breath that the consortium had been spying on her, cutting her fences, setting her fires, and the mood of the crowd turned like weather. Then she told them the rest, plain. She told them how the Platt claim was forged, and how the rumor of foul water was a lie, and how the fire was set, and she named the boot prints in the sage. And Alton Squires stood up beside her, ruined and honest, and said every word of it was true, that he'd found the same prints when he came to dig her trough. And Cassidy turned from Coles to the crowd, to the neighbors whose stock stood alive that hour only because of her. "I'll not sell the spring," she said. "Not to this man nor any man, not for 1,500 nor 15,000, because the water isn't rightly mine to sell. The hogs found it, the land kept it. I only listened. So here is what I'll do. Any man in this valley that needs water for his stock can have it, free as it comes up out of the ground, for as long as this dry lasts and after, and all I'll ask in return is a fair day's work to keep the ground and the troughs, because a gift shared is the only kind worth keeping." She looked at Coles one last time. "And I reckon that's better management than a man who'd fire a widow's hay to lower her price." The porch was still one heartbeat, and then the whole crowd of them, the mockers and the watchers both, rose up in a roar for her, and old Alton Squires took off his hat, and one by one every man on that porch took off his 60 hats, coming off in the terrible heat. And Coles gathered his papers, and Pruitt gathered his smile, and the two of them walked to their buggy through a silence of pure contempt, and drove out of Kettle Fork, and did not come back, beaten, not by any weapon, but by one plain, decent thing, done in the open, where everyone could see it. The rains came 3 weeks later, as they always do, at last, a black wall out of the range that broke over the valley and ran the dead washes bankful and turned the whole country green in a fortnight. And the folks of Kettle Fork drove their surviving stock home through mud they had prayed a year for. Cassidy Vane's spring ran on the same as ever, unbothered by the wet as it had been unbothered by the dry, because it drew from a deeper account than the sky. She paid off her note at the bank that fall with money from the drovers who now made her gate a regular stop, and her herd, grown from 80 starving skeletons bought for $24 into 300 head of the fattest hogs in the territory, ranged a parcel that was no longer gravel and sage, but broad turned pasture green from fence to fence. The whole 320 acres, slowly rooted back to life by the animals, nobody else on earth had wanted. No one in Kettle Fork called her the hog woman anymore, and no one said that thing about a lone woman playing at pigs. Or if they did, they said it now the way you say the name, of somebody you are proud to know. Toby Corley grew up on that ground and worked it beside her, and his family's well ran sweet again once she showed his father where the hogs had to dig. And old Brigida Holleran came down off her ridge one last green evening near the end, and stood at the fence watching Ferryman, grey-muzzled and dignified, lead his herd out to graze in the cool, and she put her hand on Cassidy's arm. "You see now, child," she said in her slow voice, "the land does not forget. It only grows quiet. And it hands its old rivers to whoever is patient enough to ask and humble enough to listen." She nodded at the boar and the green strip and the crowded troughs where a valley's worth of stock had drunk and lived. "You listened," she said when they were all shouting. "That is the whole of it." And Cassidy Vane, who had come west with $41 and a broken heart, and had been handed a fortune by 80 starving hogs, and a spring the old maps never showed, stood in her own green field in the last of the light, no longer a stranger, no longer a fool, no longer alone, and watched a new litter of shoats root in the dark, sweet earth, and knew that she had come home.
Merci NSD pour ton follow sur TikTok, merci beaucoup. Est-ce que tu peux m'envoyer l'adresse ou je peux t'envoyer l'adresse ou je peux t'envoyer mon mondial relais? J'ai rien compris, c'est la gazelle. Trop d'adresses dans ton mot. J'étais là, Gandalf, il y a 10 ans. Et c'était plus dur? C'est moins dur? C'est plus dur qu'il y a 10 ans? Tu pas d'accord avec quoi, Nika? Je bosse les 3-8, j'ai peur de faire un planning et de ne pas m'y tenir avec la fatigue. Ouais, alors ça, je comprends tout à fait, Micha. Malheureusement, j'ai envie de te dire, moi, mon objectif, c'est de pouvoir faire de mon métier, je veux devenir créatrice de contenu. Donc ça va passer par le stream sur Twitch, ça va passer par, la création de contenu, sur TikTok, sur Insta, sur tout ça. Si tu veux